One of the things that the finance industry has done brilliantly is capture language.
Yes.
But what's your view on how they've used language to their own ends?
Many ways the language is sort of twisted on you. Take just the word credit. Credit is a positive word in general. Credit is sort of something about trust. I give you credit for something. That means, I kind of, it's a positive thing to do, to give credit, okay? But, and so we have this instinct that, credit is good. Credit is good. If they threaten that credit will be harmed, then we can't, we got to step back, God forbid. But credit, when they give credit to somebody, somebody then owes them back the money. And they're very harsh about collecting that money. So they can dangle a loan in front of you, and to give you credit means to make you indebted. Now, it could be for a good reason, but there could be too much of this credit thing, which, in other words, credit equals debt. Debt is a negative word. So they're not saying, I'm going to make you indebted. They're saying, I'm going to give you credit. Don't you love it? Don't you love a credit card? But then people in the US live on credit card debt that they can't ever pay. And so for the banker, it's okay. They charge 20% interest or something.
29%.
It's huge, okay? So, and then they get people into that. And, too bad for Greece that it's a risky borrower and they'll charge.
So what you're getting at is that it's not, the language is used not just to indebt the individual, but when you blow it up, it's to whole countries.
So when their investment is the other people's debt, right? That's part of their investment, by the way. When they say credit will suffer, they do a whole lot of other things than give credit, than lend. When Jamie Dimon's JP Morgan Chase invested in a London whale right here in London, that money was excess deposits. In other words, money that depositors gave them that they were not lending. Instead, they wanted to play in derivatives with that money, because the amount of loans that JP Morgan Chase calls loans on their books is a fraction, not a full fraction, of their deposits. And then they have another $1 trillion plus of other debts. So they do a whole lot of things. Some of them are not even financial. In other words, this is an enormous conglomerate or a hedge fund that does a little bit of banking on this side. So in other words, there's a lot of confusion about, JP Morgan Chase or Barclays or HSBC being a quaint little bank, when in fact, Deutsche Bank and the big banks, our bank holding companies, are major, hedge fund conglomerates, the size of which the economy doesn't see anywhere else. And then when they get in trouble, they're saying, well, we're such a big corporation, we can't be governed. Actually, we'll pay a fine. We'll pay a fine, we'll settle it.
And that's a cost of doing business?
That's a cost of doing business. Is we break the law, nobody's responsible. Oops, too bad. You can't let us fail because the economy will be harmed. So let's settle it, and not too large a fine because we can't take that.
Steady
and,
on the fine.
I got to make money enough to pay the fine and survive, so I can lend to you. And I can lend to you government, and I can lend to you. And business lending, that's kind of too much work and too low scale. Yeah. So the amount of business lending that most of these banks do is minuscule, small. But lots of other stuff gets done. So that's a lot of the language. And then, of course, there is the word capital. Now, you read a book called Capital in the 21st Century by Piketty, and the word is used everywhere in economics to mean different things. In banking, they have a unique way of using that word, and then they trick you into thinking that the word capital is something that banks hold or set aside, just like cash, rainy day fund. And so when they say, you're imposing capital requirements on me and therefore I can't lend, when the requirement was basically saying, retain earnings, issue equity and invest. So here you just paid dividend to your shareholders. You could have lent that money and
could they not use profits?
They use profits, and that would be capital. Their retained earnings
but
is capital.
But there's plenty of profits.
Well, they choose to pay it out and borrow and then scream that they can't lend. Because we told them to not use 100% debt to make their loans, but to have a little bit of absorbency ability when they lose. To have just a little bit, just a few percentages. Which nobody lives like that. I mean, with no regulation, no company becomes so indebted as the banks. But then they use the word capital to confuse people about what is even the regulation about. And then they spin it that terrible things will happen if you impose that kind of regulation, which only brings them just a little bit closer to the absolute minimum that they would impose on other people when they lend. As borrowers, life is good. People give the money easily, including all of us as deposits. When we give the money to the bank as deposits, it's called a deposit, which again is a confusing word.
Why?
Because when you deposit, you think you're giving, your suitcase as deposits. It's there for you. But you're making a loan to the bank and the bank is going to go invest it. Then it's going to tell you that you want the loan from them. And then that money, they forget that they owe it to you. And you, meanwhile, think that the money is there anytime you want it. And so here we are with the depositor not even realizing that their deposit is the bank's debt, and the bank forgetting it's their debt because they view it as a great money to go play with. And so take risk with and take the upside. And if they can't pay depositors, well, there's going to be deposit insurance and central banks, and somebody will solve their so-called liquidity problem. So there's another play in words, which is everything is always in the plumbing, always in the plumbing. Just liquidity. And so the word liquidity is used all over. Oh my God, liquidity is suffering, and it's all because of these regulations, which could be true because some of these regulations are really stupid. Yeah. Really not.
It's interesting you say that because ordinarily you'd just be asking for broad brush regulation, but you're actually very discriminating when it comes to
I don't like all the regulations. I think some of the regulations are completely counterproductive, and some of the way they structure the regulation is counterproductive. They say, we're going to judge what's risky or not. A loan to Greece, perfectly safe. So the regulation is distorting away from business lending. The regulation is saying, hey, go invest over here. We view it as riskless when it's actually risky and pays high return. Of course the banks will do that. They just respond to incentives. If you put, in other words, almost everything that's wrong has to do with the opacity that makes people nervous every time, the fragility, which includes a lot of way too much debt and way too many ways to hide that, and bad regulation.
Language?
And language just helps spin to persist in that way. In other words, that's what's wrong with the actual system. What's wrong with the debate is an enormous amount of nonsense.